Now we come to Yuran Okatsang, who is, as I said, a prominent Tibetan who is a very experienced person in advocacy, especially. And she has been very deeply involved in different Tibetan associations and the movement. So, Yuran Okatsang, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Vijay G. Chase and Tibetan Youth Congress for having me on this webinar. It is indeed an honor to share the space with esteemed China expert Pierre-Antoine Donnet and Dr. Xin Jin. And I actually am thankful to both of you for giving this broad overview. Pierre gave this broad overview on situation inside Tibet and spoke about His Holiness's nonviolence, and then mentioned that. But one thing that I want to beg to differ with Pierre is that Pierre was saying that he met with some TYC members and they were advocating violence. I do not agree with that. I think TYC is seeking independence, definitely, but not advocating violence. It could be some individual that you met in Dharamsala, probably, who it's a personal, individual kind of expression, I think, you know. And then I am a little bit I cannot also help but dwell on the current global scenario, which is really dominated by a tussle between, you know, autocracy on one side and Western democracies on the other side. It looks like it's visibly Russia, but we all know that definitely China is also behind the scenes. China may have abstained from the UN Security Council draft resolution to end the Ukraine crisis, but it is simply treading carefully and calculating its risks, you know, in the light of, I think it was very, very surprised to see the strong Ukrainian resistance and Western response to the war. But China has not, if you follow the news, has not sanctioned Russia, and nor has it recognized Russia's invasion. Russia's strongest ally, we all know, strategic ally, is China, and they share the same ambition. Like Dr. Chin said, it's an excess of power, like, you know, autocratic power to establish their hegemony in a new global order. They want to carve a new global order away from the Western democracies. We all know that Xi Jinping is perhaps the only person who can convince Putin to announce ceasefire. And we heard from news reports that they had recent talks where Putin has actually expressed his readiness to kind of go for ceasefire negotiations. I hope that happens and there will be peace in Ukraine. China actually is using all its diplomacy. This is also, I think, in some ways, I do not know if this is, if China is not using it to its own advantage. You know, it's using its diplomacy, all its abundant resources in the form of manpower, money, and military to really surge ahead, I think, in its quest to be the number one global power. However, the world is becoming increasingly wary of China's ambitions. Particularly, we know about China's aggressive stance in Taiwan, constant clashes along the borders it shares with India, and the ongoing disputes with the countries in the South China Seas, to name a few. We Tibetans have been struggling and suffering under the same autocratic and oppressive Chinese regime. The Chinese Communist Party, like Dr. Chin said, you know, we have to resist the CCP. It is actually under this Chinese Communist Party, when it came to power in China in 1949, then soon after coming into power, they marched into Tibet, overpowered the small Tibetan army stationed in Tibetan city of Chamdo, and invaded our country. Like Dr. Shin Chin said, Tibet was largely isolated from the outside world at that point, ill-equipped to fight foreign occupation. The closest ally that we could rely on, India, was newly independent from Britain, with little power or even the will to come to Tibet's rescue. And His Holiness, most importantly, was only 14 years of age. So PRC could not have timed its occupation better. China, going to China's historical claim, I think Dr. Chin did a very good job of drawing all the historical relationship between China and Tibet. China claims that it was that Tibet was always a part of China since the Yuan dynasty, which is about 800 years ago, right? But if there is a legal basis to that claim, so why did China feel the need to compel the Tibetan delegation to sign the so-called 17-point agreement on this of the Central People's Government and the local government of Tibet on measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet? The liberation word itself rings, you know, that is when most colonialists, when they come to invade a country, they use that word, we came to liberate you, right? Actually, the existence of a fully functional de facto independent state of Tibet made China to kind of force Tibetans to sign that 17-point agreement. It was a legal necessity for China. So rather than liberate Tibet, this agreement actually bound Tibet for the first time to China. Before that, Tibet had historical relationships. There were Chinese influences. Yes, even British India and Mongolia also had influences over Tibet. Since the 18th century, there were actually Chinese representatives in Lhasa known as Ambans. But these Ambans were expelled from Lhasa, just like Dr. Shin mentioned in his presentation, with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. And since then, Tibet has clearly enjoyed de facto independent status. It is indeed unfortunate that we were not able to build on our international relations for recognition as a sovereign state. So while the agreement that China forced Tibetans to sign, the so-called 17-point peaceful agreement, it seems to exude this impression of maintaining the existing Tibetan political system in central Tibet. It gradually eroded the traditional Tibetan way of life, starting from eastern Tibet, leading to massive uprisings in Kham and Amdo in 1956, which gradually spread to central Tibet and then led to the mass uprising of 1959. As a result, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to escape on advice of the coterie and the oracle, and 80,000 Tibetans, fled to India. And there was heavy clampdown on the uprising, where thousands of Tibetans were arrested, Tibetans were imprisoned. And since then, PRC, under the Chinese Communist Party that we are talking about just now, has ruled Tibet with an iron fist, cracking down with full force and heavy surveillance to preempt even any dissent from even occurring. So Chinese Communist Party is at the helm of making all these important decisions. No Tibetan has ever served as party secretary of Tibet Autonomous Region, the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. The party secretary is the highest party position in TAR. Currently, it's Wu Yingji, who's about to retire this year, actually. He's already reaching the age of 65. But who will succeed him? Definitely, as always, yet another Chinese. And even in the TAR, within the TAR 7 prefectures, out of 7, there are only 2 Tibetan party secretaries. Whereas in the areas outside of TAR, there are no Tibetans at all. No Tibetan hold any top party positions. There may be a few Tibetan high-ranking bureaucrats, but these are co-opted and they are subservient to the party leadership, because party is at the helm, right? So the bureaucracy is really there, but they are serving the party leadership. So what does it show? The absence of Tibetans from positions of power is really a proof of racism, discrimination, and China's deep mistrust of Tibetans. So Tibet's rich mineral resources, on the other hand, talking about environment, the waters, environment has been irreparably devastated with damming of all major rivers, sedentarization of nomads, and excessive mining just to feed the ever-rising Chinese greed. So the destruction of fragile Tibetan ecosystem has consequences not only for neighboring downstream countries when it comes to damming of the rivers, but also has effects on global warming. The everyday life, the Tibetan way of life, is also threatened with heavy imposition and influence of Chinese policies, which is aimed really at wiping Tibetan language, culture, and identity. The facade that the Chinese have maintained is that if you do not oppose the government or participate in any activities, quote unquote, endangering national security, prosperity and success is within your reach. However, Tibetans are denied even basic stuff like their own language, the right to study their own language, practicing their own religion, gathering for religious festivals and events, expressing their opinions on matters affecting their own lives, nurturing their unique Tibetan identity. We all have recently heard news of the demolition of the 2 Buddha statues in Khamdrango, Sichuan province, just as an example of where Tibetans are not even allowed to practice their own religion freely. This was demolished last year in December on the pretext that it did not acquire government approval. Many Tibetans were detained, including the abbot of the monastery. And there were reports that these people in detention were also going through re-education, and there was a huge clampdown in the area on social media. While social media used by the Tibetans are always constantly monitored, not just in Trango, everywhere else in Tibet, and censored, China also hires people to do counterattacks on kind of on those who, and then create fake kind of accounts on social media to extensively really promote its propaganda, portraying a happy, prosperous Tibet. Even if there is some semblance of development, the question really is, who is benefiting from these? Are Tibetans really involved in any level of decision making or in these so-called developments? Tibetans are not. It's actually benefiting the Chinese more, right? Chinese workers are coming in, they're getting incentives to come and work in Tibet. Chinese are outnumbering the Tibetans in major cities of Tibet. So when it comes to freedom of expression and opinion, what has China been doing in recent times is really clamping down on all, whether you are artists, environmentalists, farmers, nomads, educationists, monks, or even simply devotees are monitored, their movements restricted, and if they do any expression of freedom or expression or opinion is cracked down upon. We just recently heard the news of Tsawa Norbu, who is a singer, a very popular artist, only 25 years old, who attempted self-immolation in front of the Potala on February 25th. We heard from the news that he was stopped very quickly and taken away by the police. And through the social media account of him, we now know that he is dead, he's no more, but we don't know the cause, the time, and the place of his death. In fact, all his songs have been removed from many apps, and his social media account has been deactivated because there's so many outpourings of condolence messages for him. Tsawa Nobu is, in fact, the 156th Tibetan inside Tibet who has attempted self-immolation. So what are all the self-immolators demanding? They are actually protesting the Chinese repressive regime, demanding freedom for Tibetans and return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet. The Chinese authorities have really targeted, just like Tsawa Norbu is an artist. So what is Chinese authorities doing at the moment? They are targeting and silencing influential Tibetans, whether they are writers, intellectuals, cultural leaders, because they view them as really hindrance in their policies of kind of integrating Tibetans into the so-called mainstream. So they have this huge campaign of cultural assimilation. So these people are hindrance, the intellectuals, the writers, the cultural leaders. We have heard about the case of Go Sharap, who is a Buddhist scholar, educationist. He's only age 46, and he has been sentenced to 10 years in prison by the Lhasa Intermediate People's Court in November last year. When he disappeared in 2020, we didn't know for 5 months where he was, until many Tibet supporters, Tibetan Human Rights Watch and organizations working for human rights demanded, and UN groups of experts, including the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and Special Rapporteur on Religion, Freedom of Religion, when they inquired on his whereabouts in July 2021, then there was this, we learned after that he has been convicted again, quote unquote, of inciting separatism. So was the language rights activist Tashi Wangchuk and many other Tibetan intellectuals. Freedom House has once again ranked Tibet as the least free country in the world, alongside Syria and South Sudan. And for the past almost 6 years, Tibet has consistently been among the worst countries in the world when it comes to political rights and civil liberties. And one issue that I most importantly want to mention is the China's politics, that they meddle in reincarnation politics. I think it's most strategic Chinese move in the religious sphere, which is really the politicization and meddling of the reincarnation of the High Lamas. This has been a China has used this historically also, even if they were to gain influence over Tibet. They used this historically. So reincarnation law was passed in 2007 by the Chinese State Administration for Religious Affairs. And what does this law say? It maintains that all the reincarnations of tulkus of Tibetan Buddhism must get government approval. Otherwise, they would be deemed illegal or invalid. It further claims that reincarnation must be born within China's borders, and mandated the use of golden urn to select top-ranking lamas. They have been forcing this on the Tibetan lamas since 2007. And they have been doing lots of meetings where selected senior monks are required to study these policies and promise their support. We recently heard of party officials visiting in Sok County as well. What we have seen is China's appointing of its own lamas, with the example of Panchen Lama, has not gone down very well. He still suffers from gaining any credibility from the Tibetan devotees, despite every effort put in by the Chinese to promote him. The same will happen to their meddling in any other appointment of high lamas, and most certainly the Dalai Lama. It is indeed really ironic that an atheist and communist party is so hell-bent on meddling in the reincarnation of Tibetan high lamas, of which they have very little or no knowledge except to control the country, because they know that Tibetans' hearts and mind is through the religion, and our identity is intrinsically linked with religion and culture. In 62, coming to the Tibetans in exile, I wanted to kind of dwell on that a little bit also. In 62 years of being in exile, Tibetans have really made steady progress towards democratic governance. It was the vision of His Holiness when soon after he came to exile that we must have democratic system. Thanks to the generous support of India and from all international agencies, we were able to fulfill that vision of having a democratic governance in exile. The evolution of political power by His Holiness in 2011, despite very strong public appeals against it, has led to political leadership being directly elected by the people, while the system is faced with all the usual challenges of a young democracy. We are a movement to be reckoned with. As Dr. Shinjin said, our political leadership is directly elected, but His Holiness still is our spiritual leader, somebody we see as a symbol of our struggle and the rallying force. So we are very, very lucky that we have His Holiness to always kind of seek advice and to help us in rallying support for Tibet. Tibetans in exile are scattered in more than 33 countries today, with a rough population of about 150,000. Today, we have actually over 64,000 Tibetans outside of the Indian subcontinent, India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and they're mostly in Europe and North America. While most of the Tibetans in India and Nepal are largely in settlements and under the direct administration of the Tibetan exile government, Tibetan diaspora outside are also connected via the various Tibetan associations we have. We have offices of Tibet under the Department of Information International Relations of the exile administration. And then there are the elected Tibetan members of parliament in North America, in Europe, and in Australasia. The Tibetan government in exile, particularly through the Office of Sikyong and the Department of Information, lobbies governments, parliamentarians, international agencies, including the United Nations. We have an office in Geneva whose main responsibility really is to lobby the United Nations. And we participate in all the various Human Rights Commission proceedings, make oral interventions, and there are civil society on. Basically, the government's main goal is resumption of negotiation with China based on the middle way approach. As was previously mentioned, under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have had 9 rounds of talks with the Chinese counterparts between 2002 and 2010. Despite the fact that Tibet was historically never a part of China, our dialogue with Chinese counterparts seeks genuine autonomy for Tibet. We have cleared our stand by submitting a memorandum to the Chinese counterparts, but we have had a deadlock since 2010. As a Tibetan member of parliament, I think most importantly, I wanted to say what the Tibetan parliament has been doing. We raise the issue of Tibet in every parliamentary sessions and pass resolutions in solidarity with Tibetans inside Tibet, and condemn Chinese oppressive policies in Tibet. We organize advocacy and campaign events, such as we also have the World Parliamentary Convention of Tibet. The first one was held in India in 1994. Since then, we've had 7 World Parliamentary Conventions of Tibet. The last one was in Riga, Latvia, which was attended by over 25 parliamentarians around the world. And there is a plan to hold one this year sometime in Washington, D.C. We also lobby parliamentarians in support to support the cause of Tibet, request them to raise our concerns in their respective houses, and pressure China to resume dialogue to find a resolution to the Tibet issue. Most recently, in December, the Tibetan Parliament was able to revive the all-party Indian Parliamentary Forum for Tibet. As you might have read in the newspapers, the political counselor of the Chinese embassy in Delhi wrote a letter to the Tibet Indian parliamentarians objecting to the participation of the Indian MPs at the dinner that Tibetan Parliament in Exile hosted, the Speaker of the House. And they called in the letter, what he said was, the political counselor, that Tibetan government in exile is an out-and-out separatist political group. And they mentioned that they oppose any form of contact by officials with them. So to that length, the China goes. So China, we are a sore thumb for China. China does see His Holiness, the Tibetans, the Tibetan government in exile, the Tibetan diaspora as a threat to their control in Tibet. They are concerned about Tibetans inside Tibet. They're concerned about Tibetans outside Tibet. Civil society in the exile community plays a prominent role in campaigning and advocating for Tibet. Among the ones directly involved in political activism are Tibetan Youth Congress, who is organizing, one of the co-hosts here, Tibetan Women's Association, Guchusum, National Democratic Party for Tibet, International Campaign for Tibet, Students for Free Tibet. We also have Tibetan language media outlets, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, Voice of Tibet, Tibet Express, and Tibet Times, which covers issues affecting Tibet and Tibetans. And some even, like Radio Free Asia, VOA, VOT, they even try to broadcast into Tibet despite constant jamming and hacking of their websites by the Chinese authorities, by the Chinese hackers, Chinese government-controlled hackers. There are over, when it comes to Tibet support groups, we have more than 100 Tibet support groups spread over 50 different countries championing the cause of Tibet. And then each Tibetan also plays a role. We all, above the age of 6, we make annual voluntary contribution towards the running of our government, of our administration. The contribution is made and registered in a green book, which is also a document that proves that you are a bona fide Tibetan, irrespective of where you live or what citizenship you have. So all Tibetans above the age of 6 have a green book, and they pay annual voluntary contribution. This green book is also used for our elections. It's also used by Tibetans when they want to send kids to their Tibetan schools or get scholarships under the Tibetan government in exile, employment within the government administration. So Tibetan diaspora in many countries, whether in India or outside, they lobby their legislatures to support Tibet. They have lobby days, and they raise issues. They seek the legislatures to raise issues affecting Tibetans inside Tibet. Together, particularly with His Holiness as the rallying force behind all our efforts, we have made several milestones. I think just from the beginning, if we go right in the beginning, I think our elders, despite all the challenges they had, they were able to kind of work with other international supporters to gain 3 UN General Assembly resolutions, 1959, 1961, 1965. The 61 resolution, in fact, recognized the right to self-determination of the Tibetan people. There have been several resolutions, mostly in the US Congress, but also Italian, French Senate, and Australian kind of Congress resolutions. Most importantly, I think I would like to mention the Tibet Policy Act of 2002, passed by the US Congress, through which the position of the Special Coordinator for Tibet under the US State Department is also established. The main kind of responsibility of this person is really to promote substantive dialogue to resolve the Tibet issue. Uzra Jaya was recently appointed under the Biden administration to the post. There's also the Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2020, which is also important because it makes it very clear to the Chinese officials that if they get involved in naming the future Dalai Lama, they would face sanctions from the US. I think that was the main, for me, that was the main highlight. And then there is also the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, of 2018, where Tibetans or people going to Tibet should get the same reciprocity that the Chinese get when they come to the US. So we've had several resolutions in the US Congress. We've had some in the Italian Senate, the French Senate. Australia has had a Tibet motion. So some of the successful campaigns that we've had as all together with the help of not just the CTA, but also Tibet support groups, Tibetan organizations, Tibetans and individuals supporting Tibet are really in the last few years would be countering the mushrooming of Confucius institutes, which are actually meant to propagate Chinese thought and ideology. We've had also a successful campaign on climate action, Tibet Third Pole campaign. Panchen Lama campaign has been consistently going on and supported. And most recently, the Boycott Beijing Olympics campaign. So I think our success lies in the fact that we are able to challenge China's attempt to really whitewash its repressive policies, most particularly in Tibet and also in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. When it comes to Boycott Beijing Olympics, we were able to kind of form a solidarity network with our brothers and sisters from Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So yes, we are dealing with the most authoritarian regime in the world. Despite being under tremendous suffering, interrogation, and surveillance, Tibetans in Tibet have not given up their hope and struggle for freedom. Tibetan diaspora is also inspired by the courage and determination shown by the Tibetans inside Tibet, and we ourselves have a very heightened sense of Tibetan identity and spirit, which China can never crush, even if it uses all its might and resources. And we will triumph, and we have hope. I think hope is with us. I think that's what Dr. Chin left us with also. It was a little bit, he left a very gloomy picture, but I still want to hope, and I'm optimistic. Nothing is permanent. And I also believe that the party must be resisted. And if there is a democratic China, we have more hope. I believe that. So long live His Holiness and free Tibet. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Yuralla. You gave a very good, in addition to the Tibetan perspective to history, you have given a very good introduction to what the exile community has been doing. Because for the outsiders, the biggest question is that even if the Tibetans living inside under Chinese occupation, even if they have limitations, so what about the Tibetans living in a free world? So your account of how the refugee community has handled itself despite such a small number, only 150,000, but its achievements, its contribution to promoting the cause of Tibet. Your presentation has been very reassuring even to a person like me who has been watching the Tibetan scene for last 50 years. So thank you very much for giving this perspective, and especially your presentation on the aspect of how the Tibetan community is handling it inside Tibet and outside Tibet.